The rain had a particular sound in that part of town. It wasn't the gentle pitter-patter of suburban showers that promised blooming gardens. It was a tired, greasy hiss as it hit the asphalt of the diner's parking lot, a sound that seeped through the window sills and mixed with the smell of stale coffee and fried onions. For Clara, it was the soundtrack to her life, a perpetual, damp melancholy that clung to the air like the humidity of a long summer night. Her feet ached. It wasn't a new sensation, but a deep, familiar throb that started in her arches and worked its way up her calves, a constant reminder of the 12 hours she'd been on them. The diner, a relic of a bygone era named the Starlight, had lost most of its shine. The neon sign outside flickered, buzzing like a dying insect, casting the worn vinyl of the booths in a sickly pink glow. Each crack in the red upholstery was a map of countless strangers, of hurried meals and lonely cups of coffee, of lives that had passed through and left their faint imprints behind. Clara moved through the space with an economy of motion born from years of practice. She refilled a trucker's coffee without being asked, her smile weary but genuine. She wiped down the counter, her cloth catching on a new tear in the formica. Every movement was automatic, a physical script she had memorized long ago. But behind her tired eyes, her mind was a whirlwind of numbers. Rent was due. The electric bill was a week past its final notice. And her youngest, 7-year-old Lily, needed new shoes. The cardboard she'd slipped into the soles of the old ones had turned to mush in the afternoon's downpour. The numbers never added up. They were a cruel, unyielding arithmetic that governed her sleep and haunted her waking hours. The tips in her apron pocket felt light, a handful of loose change and a few crumpled dollar bills that wouldn't be enough. Not nearly enough. Mr. Thompson, the diner's owner, watched her from his perch by the cash register. He was a man whose small frame seemed to contain an ocean of petty cruelty. His eyes, small and dark, followed her every move. He counted the sugar packets she put out. He timed her breaks down to the second. He had a way of speaking to her, a low, condescending tone, that made her feel smaller than she already did. "Clara," he called out, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the diner. "That table in the corner. It's been sitting for 5 minutes. You think these folks have all night?" She didn't point out that she had just taken their order 2 minutes ago. She didn't mention the other 3 tables she was juggling. She simply nodded, the gesture pulling at the tight muscles in her neck. "Yes, Mr. Thompson." Right away, her apology was a currency she paid in daily, a toll for the privilege of earning a wage that barely kept her and her children from falling off the edge. She had 3 of them. Leo, the oldest at 12, was already trying to be the man of the house, his face a constant, serious mask of worry. 9-year-old Sam was the quiet one, lost in books and drawings. And then there was Lily, whose bright, innocent spirit was the one light that hadn't yet been dimmed by their circumstances. They were the reason for the ache in her feet and the deeper ache in her heart. They were waiting for her at home, in their tiny, drafty apartment 2 blocks away. She pictured them now, Leo reading to the younger 2, the single bare bulb in the living room illuminating their small faces. She had left them with the last of the bread and a can of soup for dinner, promising she would bring something home from the diner. A promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Mr. Thompson had a strict "no free food for staff" policy. He would rather scrape perfectly good leftovers into the trash than let her take a plate of cold fries home to her hungry children. He called it preventing theft, Clara called it what it was. Cruelty. The bell above the door chimed, a harsh, discordant jangle that made her flinch. It wasn't the usual sound of a stray customer seeking refuge from the rain. This was different. The air in the diner shifted, growing heavy and charged. They filled the doorway, blocking out what little light was left of the dreary evening. There were 5 of them, men built on a scale that seemed too large for the cramped confines of the Starlight. They wore heavy leather vests, cut to reveal arms covered in intricate tapestries of ink. Their jeans were faded and worn, their boots scuffed and heavy. Rain dripped from their long hair and beards, pooling on the checkered linoleum floor. The diner fell silent. The trucker in the corner booth froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The couple on their date stopped talking, their eyes wide. Even Mr. Thompson seemed to shrink behind his register. These were not the usual patrons. They were bikers, members of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, a group known more by whispered rumors than by fact. They were a specter that haunted the edges of town, a symbol of something wild and dangerous. One of them, a man with a beard the color of salt and pepper and shoulders as wide as the diner's door, stepped forward. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Clara, she felt a tremor of pure, primal fear. Her hand instinctively went to her apron pocket, clutching the few dollars there as if they could offer some form of protection. "We need a table," the large man rumbled, his voice like gravel turning in a cement mixer. Clara swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She glanced at Mr. Thompson, who gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Serve them. Get them out." His eyes were wide with a fear that mirrored her own. "Of course," she managed, her voice a thin whisper. "Right this way," she led them to the largest booth in the back, the one usually reserved for families. They slid onto the vinyl seats, the material groaning in protest under their combined weight. They moved with a strange, quiet grace, a team of predators settling in their den. The air around them smelled of wet leather, gasoline, and the cold night air. Clara's hands trembled as she handed out the plastic-coated menus. She kept her eyes down, focusing on their hands, on the thick, calloused fingers and the heavy silver rings. She tried not to look at their faces, at the hard lines etched by wind and road, at the unreadable expressions in their eyes. "Coffee," the leader said. "Black." "For all of us," she nodded and fled to the perceived safety of the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel their eyes on her back as she poured the coffee, her hands shaking so badly she spilled some on the saucer. Mr. Thompson watched her, his expression a mixture of fear and annoyance. "Don't mess this up, Clara," he hissed as she walked past. She served them their coffee in silence. They took the mugs without a word, their presence a silent, looming thundercloud in the small diner. She retreated again, standing by the service window, pretending to be busy, trying to will herself to be invisible. It was then that the bell on the door chimed again, this time a softer, more familiar sound. Her 3 children stood there, huddled together just inside the door, their clothes damp from the rain. Leo stood in front, his small shoulders squared, trying to look brave. Sam clutched his older brother's jacket, and Lily peeked out from behind him, her eyes wide and searching. They found Clara, and a wave of relief washed over Lily's face. Clara's heart dropped. They were supposed to stay home. They were never supposed to come here. Leo must have known she wouldn't have money to bring food home. He must have known, and in his quiet, 12-year-old way, he had decided to act. "Mama?" Lily's small voice was barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in the silent diner. Mr. Thompson's head snapped up. A dark scowl formed on his face. "Clara, what is the meaning of this?" "I run a business, not a daycare." Shame and panic washed over Clara in a hot wave. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. They were supposed to." "I'll get them out of here." She rushed to the door, kneeling down to her children's level. "What are you doing here, sweethearts?" "I told you I'd be home soon. We were hungry, Mama," Leo said, his voice low and steady, though she could see the tremor in his hands. The soup it wasn't enough. Her heart shattered. The simple, honest truth of his words was a physical blow. She pulled them into a hug, burying her face in their damp hair, trying to shield them from the prying eyes of the diner, from the cold glare of her boss. She had one option. It was a risk, a terrible one, but she had to take it. Using her employee discount, she could afford one meal. One single plate. It was all the money she had. "Go sit in that small booth by the window," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Don't make a sound. Be good. I'll bring you something." They nodded and scurried to the booth, their movement small and quiet, as if they understood the precariousness of the situation. Clara stood up and walked to the kitchen's order window, her back straight, her dignity a fragile shield. "One order of the meatloaf special," she said to the cook, her voice barely audible. She paid for it with the entirety of her tips, the coins and crumpled bills sliding from her hand onto the counter. When the plate was ready, she took it to the booth where her children sat. It was a generous portion for one person, with a thick slice of meatloaf, a scoop of mashed potatoes, and a helping of green beans. For 3 growing children, it was a meager offering. They watched her with wide, hungry eyes as she picked up the fork and knife. She didn't eat. She never ate. She carefully, methodically, cut the slice of meatloaf into 3 equal pieces. She divided the mashed potatoes into 3 small mounds. She separated the green beans, counting them out to ensure each child received the exact same number. She placed a piece of meatloaf, a mound of potatoes, and a small pile of beans on each of their napkins, which served as makeshift plates. They didn't complain. They didn't fight. They ate with a quiet, desperate hunger, their small hands carefully guiding the food to their mouths. Clara watched them, a fierce, protective love swelling in her chest. It was a painful, beautiful sight. Her children, sharing a single meal on a rainy Tuesday night in a rundown diner. This was her world. This was her struggle. This was her love. And she was completely unaware that from the back of the diner, 5 pairs of eyes were watching the entire, heartbreaking ritual. The bikers hadn't spoken a word. They had seen the children arrive. They had heard the manager's cruel remark. And they had watched, in absolute silence, as a mother divided one meal into 3, keeping nothing for herself. The leader, the one they called Bear, caught the eye of the man next to him. No words were exchanged. None were needed. A silent understanding passed between them, an entire conversation held in a single, steady gaze. They had seen enough. When the children had finished, licking every last crumb from their napkins, Clara shooed them gently towards the door. "Go straight home. Lock the door behind you. I'll be there as soon as my shift is over." As they left, the bell jangling softly behind them, Clara felt a profound sense of failure. She had fed them, yes, but tomorrow the hunger would return. Tomorrow, the bills would still be there. Tomorrow, nothing would have changed. She returned to her duties, her body moving on autopilot, her mind a numb fog of despair. She cleared plates, wiped tables, and refilled coffees, avoiding the gaze of the bikers in the back booth. After a while, Bear raised a hand to signal for the check. Clara walked over, her notepad in hand, her heart still aching. "Are you ready for the bill?" Bear looked at her, his eyes not hard or cold, but filled with a strange, quiet intensity. "Yes." "And add on the meal for your kids." Clara's head shot up. "Oh, no, sir. I couldn't. I already paid for it." "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Add it anyway." He pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket and peeled off a $100 bill, placing it on the table. "And this is for you. Keep the change." Clara stared at the money, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was more than she made in 3 shifts. I can't accept this." "You're not accepting it," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You earned it." He stood up, and the other 4 men rose with him. They moved towards the door, a silent, intimidating procession of leather and denim. At the door, Bear paused and turned back to look at her. He nodded once, a gesture of respect that felt heavier and more meaningful than any words. Then, they were gone, the bell above the door marking their exit. The diner suddenly felt too quiet, too empty. Clara was left standing there, staring at the $100 bill. It felt like a lifeline. It felt like a miracle. But as she picked it up, her hand trembling, she saw Mr. Thompson marching towards her, his face a mask of pure rage. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper. "Soliciting tips from customers. Running a sob story with your brats to make a quick buck? No, Mr. Thompson, I would never, don't lie to me, he snapped, his eyes darting to the money in her hand. You used my diner, my customers, to beg for money. And you brought your filthy kids in here, breaking every rule I have, he pointed a trembling finger at the door. You're fired, Clara. Get out. Now, the words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Fired. The one, precarious thread she had been clinging to was severed. The $100 bill in her hand suddenly felt worthless, a cruel joke. It would pay the electric bill, maybe by a week's worth of groceries. And then what? Please, Mr. Thompson, she begged, tears finally welling in her eyes. Please, I need this job. My kids, your kids are not my problem, he said, his voice cold and final. Give me your apron and get out of my diner. Numbly, she untied the stained apron strings and handed it to him. She walked out of the Starlight Diner, not into the relief of the end of a shift, but into the terrifying abyss of unemployment. The rain was falling harder now, cold and relentless. It soaked through her thin uniform as she walked the 2 blocks home, each step heavier than the last. The next 2 days were a blur of quiet panic. The $100 was a temporary dam against a flood of despair. She bought groceries, real groceries, not just bread and soup. She bought new shoes for Lily. For one brief afternoon, there was a sense of normalcy, of peace. But it was a fragile peace, easily shattered by the thought of the coming weeks. She spent hours looking through the classifieds, calling numbers for jobs that were already taken or for which she wasn't qualified. The rejections were polite but firm, each one another small chip in her dwindling hope. The apartment felt colder, the walls closing in. She would sit by the window for hours, watching the rain, the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightening with each passing minute. She had hit rock bottom, and she couldn't see a way back up. She felt utterly and completely alone. On the 3rd day, the rain finally stopped. A weak, watery sun tried to break through the thick blanket of gray clouds. It was mid-afternoon when she first heard it. A low, distant hum. At first, she thought it was a plane or a heavy truck on the highway. But the sound didn't fade. It grew. It was a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up through the floorboards, a sound she felt in her bones before she could truly hear it with her ears. It grew louder and louder, a steady, building crescendo that rattled the windowpanes in their frames. Leo and Sam ran to the window, their faces pressed against the cool glass. What is that, Mama? Leo asked, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. Clara joined them, her heart beginning to pound with a strange, inexplicable dread. She looked down at the street below. And her breath caught in her throat. It was a river. A river of chrome and steel, flowing down their quiet, residential street. Motorcycles. Not 5. Not 10. Dozens. Scores. Then hundreds. They stretched as far as she could see in both directions, an endless, thundering procession of polished metal and black leather. They moved slowly, purposefully, their engines a synchronized roar that drowned out every other sound in the world. It was an army on wheels. Neighbors began to appear at their windows, their faces pale with shock and fear. Doors were locked. Curtains were pulled tight. The entire neighborhood held its breath, watching the impossible spectacle unfold. The river of bikes slowed, and then, with a final, deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building, the engines were cut. An eerie, profound silence fell over the street, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the creak of leather. And they all stopped. Directly in front of her apartment building. Clara's mind raced. An accident? A police raid? But there were no sirens, no flashing lights. Then, she saw him. At the very front of the procession, dismounting from a bike larger than all the others, was Bear. He took off his helmet, and his eyes, clear and focused, scanned the building until they found her window. He found her. And he nodded. The same simple, respectful gesture he had given her in the diner. Her legs felt weak. She backed away from the window, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. A knock came at her door. It wasn't a loud, aggressive banging, but a firm, steady rap. She opened it a crack, her heart in her throat. Bear stood there, flanked by two other bikers. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was not unkind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We heard you lost your job." Clara could only nod, speechless. "We don't think that was right," he continued. "A person does something good, they shouldn't be punished for it. It's not how the world is supposed to work." He stepped aside, and behind him, two other men began walking up the stairs, their arms laden with grocery bags. More followed. Bag after bag of food. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, milk, bread. More food than she had seen in years. They filed past her into the apartment, quietly and respectfully placing the bags on her small kitchen counter until it was overflowing. "We have a code," Bear explained, his eyes fixed on hers. "We protect what protects us. You showed kindness to us when no one else would. You fed your kids when you had nothing. That's honor. That's strength. That's family. And the Iron Saints, we take care of family." Tears streamed down Clara's face, hot and silent. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination born of desperation. But, why? How? She stammered. "One of our guys stayed behind the other night," Bear said. "He saw what happened with your boss. He heard everything. We decided Mr. Thompson needed to have a conversation about his business practices." Just then, another biker, a man with a kind face and silver hair, came up the stairs. "It's done, Bear. The papers are signed." Bear nodded. He turned back to Clara. "The Starlight Diner has new ownership. As of 10 minutes ago, it belongs to us." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "And we need a new manager," he said. "Someone who knows the business. Someone who knows what it means to work hard. Someone who understands that people are more important than profit." He held out a set of keys. "The job is yours, if you want it. You set your own hours. You set your own salary. And from now on, no one ever has to pay for a meal they can't afford. Especially kids. That's the new house rule." She looked from the keys in his hand to the faces of her children, who were peeking out from behind her, their eyes wide with awe. She looked at the mountain of food on her counter. She looked out the window at the silent, waiting army that had come to her rescue. She took the keys. Her hand closed around the cool metal. It felt solid. It felt real. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling impossibly small, hopelessly inadequate for the magnitude of the gift. Bear simply nodded again. "Get your family settled. We'll be downstairs. We've got a few repairs to make for you." For the next several hours, the quiet street was a hive of activity. The bikers, this intimidating legion of outlaws, transformed into a team of carpenters, electricians, and plumbers. They fixed the leaky faucet in her sink. They patched the drafty window frame. They replaced the faulty wiring in the living room and installed a new, bright light fixture. They worked with a quiet, focused efficiency that was breathtaking to watch. As evening fell, they packed up their tools. They had restocked her life, repaired her home, and restored her hope. One by one, they mounted their bikes. Bear was the last to get on his. He looked up at her window one last time. Clara stood there with her children, her hand raised in a silent wave of gratitude. With a single hand signal from their leader, 1,000 engines roared to life in perfect, thundering unison. The sound was no longer frightening. It was the sound of salvation. It was a triumphant chorus that echoed through the streets. And then, as one, the river of chrome and steel began to move, flowing back out of her life as quickly as it had entered, leaving behind a profound and permanent change. That night, for the first time in years, Clara tucked her children into their beds without the gnawing ache of fear in her stomach. Their bellies were full. Their home was warm. Their future, once a terrifying, dark void, was now bright with possibility. She stood in the doorway of their room, watching the steady rise and fall of their chests in the soft glow of their new nightlight. She had learned something profound in the last few days. She learned that kindness is a seed. You plant it in the most unlikely soil, with no expectation of a harvest, and sometimes, just sometimes, it grows into a forest. She learned that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they wear leather and ride motorcycles. And she learned that family isn't always the one you are born into. Sometimes, it's the one that finds you when you need it most. The world was still a hard place, but it was not without its saints. They just rode on iron horses.